So we're talking
To
with
me, it's
John
an
Shelby
exciting news
Spong.
story.
I love it. John Shelby Spong, the book is called The Fourth Gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic. And Bishop Spong, you try to paint a picture of, as you've been expressing with us here, of a different way to understand the story. And it sounds to me like you're saying that you, along with me and others of us, have brought a story with us that we're reading into the Gospel of John, or all the Gospels, that we're reading this through a lens of a different story and trying to make it say
Absolutely
something
correct.
that it never said. Because I hear
Absolutely.
people accuse you all the time, and others of us as well, of like, well, you guys are changing the gospel. Like, if you just read it as it is, you wouldn't conclude the way Spong is concluding this thing. You'd conclude totally differently.
Yeah.
And what's
Yeah.
curious is you're saying you're not the one who's messing with it, that all of us bring another story, and if you let the story speak for itself, it wouldn't conclude the kinds of things that have a structure in which God has to be rescued from God's self.
Yep, most Christians don't understand a lot about biblical history. The story of Jesus was lived according to the best estimates that we can put together between 4 BC or BCE and 30 of this common era. The first gospel is not written for about 42 years after the death of Jesus. The last gospel was written about 70 years after the death of Jesus. They're both written, all four of them are written in a language neither Jesus nor his disciples spoke. So the Christian faith had to live somewhere before we wrote it down in the Gospels.
Right.
And the place it clearly lived was in the synagogue, because by the time the Gospels are written, Jesus has been wrapped inside the Hebrew Scriptures. Now he becomes the new Moses, the new Elijah, the prophet of whom Moses spoke. He becomes the messianic figure. He becomes the son of David who has to be born in Bethlehem. He fulfills all the messianic expectations. The only place those images could have been wrapped around him was in the synagogue. People think today that just because those are biblical references that everybody had access to a Bible. There was no Gideon Society in the first century. Your hotel didn't have a Bible in it, and nobody owned a Bible. The only place the Scriptures existed was in the synagogue, and the only place they were ever read or studied or lectured on was in the synagogue, because nobody could afford them. So that somewhere between 30 and 70, the story of Jesus got enmeshed inside a Jewish frame of reference. Now, I think if we don't recover that Jewish frame of reference, we'll never be able to understand it. We wouldn't understand such things as the Sermon on the Mount is not something Jesus ever said. It's a creation on the part of the author of Matthew, and it's based on Psalm 119, which was the psalm the Jews used in the synagogue to celebrate the festival they call Shavuot, which was the time when they remembered God giving Moses the Torah and the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. So he's portraying the whole Sermon on the Mount as Jesus fulfilling a new expectation of the messianic role of the new Moses, and he's going to give you a new interpretation of a new Torah from a new mountain. Yeah. That's just one.
Well, how come, Bishop Spong, tell me, how come it's important to stress for you to stress that Jesus didn't say it? How come Jesus wouldn't have thought, you know what, I want to tell a story I want to retell the story of the new humanity using the rubric of Mount Sinai, and I want to take the Ten Commandments, and I want to rebake. How come Jesus couldn't have said those?
Jesus actually did that, and these were eyewitness accounts. It seems to me that somebody other than Matthew might have recorded it. But only Matthew records a Sermon on the Mount. There's no Sermon on the Mount in any other gospel. And part of the reason for Matthew recording it is that if you study Matthew deeply enough, you find that he is the most Jewish, and that the image of Moses magnified is the primary way that he talks about Jesus. Only in Matthew, for example, do you have Herod going down and killing all the boy babies in Bethlehem to get rid of the promised deliverer. That's a Moses story.
Sure.
The Pharaoh did that.
Yeah, right.
Went down to Egypt, killed all the boy babies, and so you see Matthew making the baptism of Jesus, the Red Sea experience.
Yeah.
After the baptism, Jesus goes in the wilderness for 40 days. After the Red Sea experience, Moses went into the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus has 3 temptations. Moses has 3 critical experiences. If you put them together, they're all identical. The first one had to do with the shortage of food. The second one had to do with putting God to the test. And the third one had to do with worshiping something other than God. You see the pattern of the Old Testament deeply
in
what
we call non-identical repetition in our world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So talk me through this a little bit. those truths that in this case Matthew or the Matthew community recognized, and they're telling the Sermon on the Mount as this great call to live the new humanity of Jesus. If the community of Matthew or some author of Matthew could have come up with that, why could Jesus not have come up with that? Like why do we follow a Jesus why don't we just say we're Matthewites, right? Why have if they were the ones who discovered it, not because it came from Jesus, who's the exemplar human, who's found sacrifice of oneself to be love of fellow man and love of God. Jesus did that. Why is it that the gospel writers had to discover these kinds of truths that they write independent of Jesus?
I think what you're missing here is the Gospels are not histories or biographies. Yeah. They are portraits painted by Jewish artists trying to interpret the power of the Jesus experience. You can't take the Jesus experience away from that. But that doesn't mean that when the portrait paints the painting, he's giving you a photograph or a tape recording. It means he's interpreting the total impact of the life of Jesus. And the reason the Sermon on the Mount, to go back to that for just a moment, if you analyze the Gospel of Matthew particularly, you'll find that he follows the Jewish liturgical year.
Yeah.
John the Baptist is the sort of Matthew version of Rosh Hashanah, the New Year. Matthew tells appropriate stories for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And when he gets around to the Sermon on the Mount, what is in the background of the Jewish worship is this festival of Shavuot, which was Jewish Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, in which they celebrated the giving of the Ten Commandments. And so what Matthew is doing is writing a Jesus story for use in the synagogue that will be appropriate to Shavuot. And the reason it's as long as it is, the Sermon on the Mount, is that Shavuot was a 24-hour vigil. Right. And so you had to have enough of this story to last through 8 3-hour segments. And so there are 8 Beatitudes and then 8 commentaries on the Beatitudes. You begin to understand the framework of Matthew's Gospel. And it's not a matter of him doing some plagiarism job or trying to say things are true that aren't true.
Sure.
It's Matthew trying to interpret in the light of his particularly Jewish community the impact of the experience of Jesus of Nazareth, in whom they were convinced that the Holy God had been present. Then how do you talk about that as Jewish people in the first century?
Yeah.
By the time you get to the 4th century in the Council of Nicaea, God is a external being that lives above the sky, and Jesus is the incarnation of that external being, and they had to figure out how God got out of the sky and into Jesus.
Right, that was a big 400 years. There was a lot going on. Well, okay, so let me play with this.
If you go back to the Gospels, you'll find that Mark, the first Gospel, says that God got into him at baptism.
That's right.
And Matthew and Luke say God got into him at conception. And John says, no, God was always in him from the foundation of the world. So that even they're wrestling with the dichotomy of a distant God and a God experience in Jesus of Nazareth.
So let's... I just want to play with this idea a little more, because I want Jesus saying a little more than I think than what you need Jesus to say. So help me on this one. If I want to do if I want to talk about Bruce Springsteen music, and I want to say here's what its meaning is, here's why it matters, here's why you should listen to the album Nebraska, right? And I want someone to hear that music and to be affected by it, because I think he's a prophetic voice in our world, right? And I start to say, here's what Bruce Springsteen says, but it's not anything Bruce Springsteen ever actually said. It's stuff that I wanted Bruce Springsteen to say because of how I was affected by something else he said. I don't think it's would be right or fair of me, as in any kind of an artistic function, as a poet or a painter or anything, to say, well, here's what he said, as opposed to here's how I was affected by what he said. So how does somebody think about a gospel writer saying, well, Jesus never actually said these things, but I don't think
the gospel writer thought that way. The gospel writer was writing liturgy more than anything else. Go back to the I am sayings.
Yeah.
Do you really think that Jesus wandered around Jerusalem or Galilee saying, oh, by the way, I am the bread of life, or I am the shepherd, or I am the vine? I don't know that would have made much sense. But if the Christian community believes that they have found in him that which satisfies their deepest hunger, then that community can hear him saying, I am the bread of life. And by the time you finish the gospel, the Eucharist is deeply attached to some of the sayings of Jesus. That's why he says after the feeding of the 5,000, which is clearly a Eucharistic feast, where they even use the verbs, he takes bread, he blesses bread, he breaks bread, he gives bread. They gather up a great abundance afterwards. And you know, that can't be literal, but it can be profoundly meaningful. There's something about the power of Jesus that expands itself. It can fill the deepest hunger of all the people, and there's a great abundance left over. That's a pretty profound story. I think what you don't understand is that the Gospels were originally sermons preached by itinerant preachers in a community, and over the period of time they gathered around the Jewish symbols, the Jewish liturgical days, and so there was Jesus stories for every part of the synagogue's life. There's an historical Jesus behind all that, but I don't know that we can capture it. In the Jesus Seminar, where I worked for about 15 years, I think their final conclusion was that maybe 16% of all the sayings of Jesus in the entire New Testament were authentic, and about 84% were not authentic, at least not literally authentic, in that was the church's communication to one another about the meaning of Jesus more than Jesus' communication to the church. And when you get to the prayer of the high priestly prayer in St. John's Gospel, it's all about the sort of torture and persecution that the Johannine community is undergoing when that is written. The Christians weren't being persecuted by the Jews when Jesus was alive.
Right.
So that, you know, you've got to read it through a different timeline. And I think, you know, I grew up a fundamentalist, and every word was the Word of God, and Jesus literally spoke it, and Jesus did everything that he said to have done. And, you know, after a while, that reaches a shallow point. I'm not destroying the Bible. I'm opening it to a much more profound meaning.
Bishop Spong, did it ever surprise
wine, with which John opens the book of signs, here are waters of Jewish purification turned into the wine of the Christian spirit. That's a much more powerful thing than thinking that he was in the winemaking business.
Right. Did it ever surprise you?
He says in that he not only turned water into wine, he turned it into 150 gallons of wine. That's enough to keep a party going for a right long time.
That's right. I know guys like that. To college guys like that. Did it ever surprise you when you were doing your work at the Jesus Seminar that with Jesus' great influence, like he was so influential that a whole community formed around his notion, essence, idea, life, that people didn't keep track of more things that he said? Like, I felt that way just looking at what's listed in the Gospels. Like, there's not very much actually in the Gospels. If you take all the things Jesus said, it's not very much. You know, we've said more in this radio interview than Jesus says in all the Gospels, right? Like, what was it about the first century that the people didn't write that stuff? Like, didn't have more to take 16% of what's in the Gospels? Be like, how come nobody is paying attention to this guy if he was so that?
Yeah, I don't think you understand the dynamics.
I must not, because it seems confusing. Like Josephus, he writes all kinds of stuff down. You know, I mean,
I was on a book tour with my book Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, and I was booked on to Tom Snyder's late night talk show. I don't know if you remember Tom Snyder.
I'm old enough to remember Tom Snyder. The intern
Tom
Quincy
Snyder was a sort of disillusioned Roman Catholic. He'd been through a couple of divorces, and the church had not been very supportive, and he's pretty angry, and he's sort of he's out of organized religion. But anyway, we were talking, and I was talking about the dates of the Gospels. And I said the Gospels are written, most scholars think, between 40 and 70 years after the crucifixion, or 70 to 100, between the years 70 and 100. And Tom said, now, wait a minute, Bishop. That means that they couldn't have been written by eyewitnesses because nobody lived to be that age in the first century. And I said, well, that's right, Tom. They aren't written by eyewitnesses. They're not even written in a language that Jesus spoke. And he said, well, that's not what the nuns taught me when I was in parochial school. And I said, what did they teach you, Tom? And he said, they taught me that the disciples followed Jesus around and wrote down everything he said, and that's where we got the Gospels. And I said, Tom, did the nuns tell you that the disciples used ballpoint pens and spiral notebooks? And that's when this look came over his face as if he had never thought about that. In the first century, only about 1 in 1,000 people could write. Only about 1 in 100 could read. This is not eyewitness reporting.
Sure.
This is interpretation, a generation, 2 generations, even 3 generations after the end of this man's life. And what Christians don't realize is that the Christian movement was a part of the synagogue until about the year 88. So Mark, Matthew, and Luke were probably all written before the split in the synagogue. John is the only gospel to be written after the split, which I think accounts for the negativity toward Jews, because the Jews become the name of the Orthodox party. The Christians in the Johannine community were also Jews.
Yeah.
It was an inter-party fight.
Right,
and so once you get that opened up, then you don't see this as Christians against Jews. This is Jews fighting with Jews, just like liberal Christians fighting with fundamentalist Christians for the future of the movement. And so John's Gospel, you can even get rid of the anti-Semitism there, which I was happy to do, because I think that's the deepest stain on Christian history, what we've done to the Jewish people.
And I get that people didn't walk around with a ballpoint pen and a binder, but people do remember what folks say, and it seems to me that they could have remembered
40 years ago.
They could have remembered. I mean, I remember stuff that was said 40 years. You know, when it gets caught, when it gets quoted inside of a functional community, like there's things that we all know our families have said, and sometimes we remember because we remember somebody else telling us what they said, and so it feels to me like there could be a bit more. But it's sort of a side point. It just feels to me like there could be a bit more of any of the gospel writers picking up a fragment, a nuance, a retelling of what Jesus said without it being made of whole cloth, totally separate. And I know that's not really what you're saying, but
I understand that, and I appreciate that, but you still need to understand something like the raising of Lazarus, which is told in great detail in the 11th chapter of John.
Yeah.
That's somewhere between 95 and 100. Now, that story says that Jesus raised from the dead in a very public place with a lot of people around, including his critics, a man who had been dead for 4 days, already bound in his funeral clothes, inside a cave, and his body decomposing. And Jesus calls him out. Now, you think nobody would write about that for 65 or 70 years if that had really happened? I don't think that's possible. But what I think is going on here is that John has taken the parable of Lazarus and Dives out of Luke. And when Lazarus, when Abraham says to Dives, they wouldn't believe even if somebody was raised from the dead. He's making that an historical story.
He fleshed
it out. And so Lazarus is raised from the dead, and what happens? That becomes the occasion in John's Gospel that leads directly to the crucifixion. There's no cleansing of the temple in John except in chapter 2. You know, there's no cleansing of the temple to be the thing that brings about the crucifixion as it is in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So he makes the story of Lazarus being raised the catalyst for the crucifixion, which is to exactly live out what the parable of Lazarus and Dives said would happen. They won't believe even if one is raised from the dead.
Right.
So I think you've got to get into a very different Jewish mindset, and you've got to know the Jewish scriptures very deeply before you can begin to understand any of the Gospels, and most especially the fourth Gospel.
So, we have a regular connection with current day atheists here on the show, and we love it, and have lots of friendships and conversations with those folks. And I would imagine some of them are listening, and will listen, and they'll be yelling at their computers things like, "Yeah, that's what I think, Bishop Spong. That's why you should walk away from Christianity," right? They're like, everything you're saying, we totally get. Why do you stay Christian? And I know that even in this book, you're more committed to being a follower of Christ and a Christian now than in your 82 years. So to those people who hear all of this and are like, I've bought everything you're saying, and it led me right out of the room. What is it that keeps you
see, what I'd like to say to those people is that what you have reacted to is a very literalistic, fundamentalist understanding of Christianity. And I'm trying to offer you a very different one that will bring you back. Now, I have no desire to leave the Christian church. I treasure my life in the Christian church. I identify myself very consciously as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus. I go to church every Sunday of my life. I say even the 4th century creeds without my fingers being crossed.
You do?
Understand them as 4th century pieces of literature.
Come on, you must have crossed your fingers once.
Yeah. Just bring a mouthwash to...
No, you see, I think there are songs that the 4th century began to sing to their understanding of God, and I have no trouble singing the 4th century song. Would I write the song that way?
That's right.
I don't think the creed is a girdle into which I've got to force my 21st century flabby faith. I think the creeds are a love song that 4th century people sang to Christ or to God. I have no trouble singing their song. But I think if we could bind if we could break open the scriptures and break open the literalism in which I was raised, that those people that you call the atheists or the agnostics or the church dropouts or what I call the Church Alumni Association might be willing to look at this Christ story again. Because this Christ story tells us three things that I don't want ever to lose. One is that every human life is holy. The second is that every human life is loved. And the third is that the purpose of every human life is to become everything that it's capable of being. That's what I mean by Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that's the God I see revealed in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And to me, it's more important than almost anything I can imagine.
Well, that's Bishop Spong. This current book is his 24th, and if it's for you your first, it's worth picking up. It's called The Fourth Gospel: Tales of a Jewish Mystic. So if you've heard Bishop Spong here describing the need to see the world through a Jewish perspective, I think it's safe to say, isn't it, Bishop, that you're writing this book to help people see the Gospels through the lens of a Jewish mystic. Is that right?
Yeah, but I write books to help me see.
Even better.
I hope that other people are where I am so they too can see. But every book, I think, is ultimately autobiographical.
Oh, that's fantastic. Hey, I know you don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but do you have a 25th book in the
at age 82, it would be presumptuous to plan too far in advance. I don't even buy green bananas.
Yeah, there you go.
But I'm working now on the Gospel of Matthew because I discipline my life around a particular book for a period of time. Whether it'll ever become a book or not, I don't know. But anyway, right now I'm deep into a study of Matthew's Gospel.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm glad you endeavored into the fourth gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic.
I am too. I've really loved it.
Thank you, Bishop Spong.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you.
Thanks so much. We'll talk with you soon. That's Bishop Spong on a terrific conversation. At least I thought. I mean,
I enjoyed that.
We got super nerdy there for a while, didn't we? I love that stuff. It was great. I love it. Yeah, I mean, geeking out like that. So,
what percentage of what Jesus said was really what he said?
Yeah. It's just, I mean, there's a guy who's been doing some counting.
Yes, serious statistical analysis.
I'm still thrown by the actual words, let alone where they came from.
I know.
All right, so Doug Pagitt Radio, broadcasting live out of the Twin Cities. Next week, we'll be back, and then
Independence Day.
Independence Day. Do what we want.
That's right.
We should have British. I should get a bunch of British guests on.
You should.
Perfect. All right, we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, everybody. See you down the road.